Now in the chapter on information, he's discussing how information is used, and you may know in ancient Greece, it was believed that it was a virtue to study knowledge for its own sake, and that the highest forms of knowledge was not knowledge that was immediately practical, but it was something that was transcendent, and it was for its own sake. It really had no worldly purpose. It only had purpose of meeting a higher existence, or a higher way. I don't know how to describe it, but it was not immediately practical anyways, and there was such a concept as for its own sake. But Postman says that the idea of information for its own sake was alien to all the Enlightenment philosophers. And he says that information in this time was not given to make one informed, that was an alien concept. You were not informing people by having a speech. Like, you have Thomas Paine writing The Age of Reason or Common Sense, these pamphlets that were given out during the Revolutionary era of the United States. The writing was not meant to inform people. It was meant to make people do things, to rile people up. And this is what Postman says here on page 87. He says, "One did not give information to make another informed. One gave information to make another do something or feel something, and the doing and feeling were themselves part of a larger idea. Information was, in short, a rhetorical instrument, and this idea did not greatly change until the mid-19th century." So what Postman is saying here in this part is that today we're bringing back the idea of information not being for a purpose, but being, like what he said before, about making one informed, but not having a direct purpose. And he ties that to the rise of images. He says, first of all, that the invention of the telegraph made words and messages, really made it a thing, and a thing desirable. And you could only have this one little telegraph were often short, just like little messages. And we can see all kinds of parallels with that with Twitter. Twitter is, you only get 150 characters. I can't remember now. I don't know what the huge appeal of Twitter is. I don't know. I tried it and I don't know what the appeal is. All you get is just looking at people you think that are popular, looking at their Twitters and retweeting them, and I think it's fairly useless. You can't convey. There's not enough characters to convey a really good, great idea. But the point is that he thinks that in this period of time, we're back to contextless, little tiny speech, little messages, little sound bites. You can drop in 150 characters. You can drop a little sound bite, not an argument, but a sound bite. And the same thing can be done with images. And of course, what do we see? We see the rise of Instagram and Tumblr, Facebook, which is a lot of just, if you scroll down a Facebook page, also you're seeing pictures. You're seeing people who posted stuff they found on the internet, or reposting stuff, or liked stuff. It's mostly images. Not a lot of people writing statuses. Mostly people just copying images or videos they thought were funny. So again, Postman thinks that we're back to this contextless imagery and dropping out of context, or these little soundbite messages, and you see these like images of like poor African children or war-torn Iraq, or you just see a depressing image, but there's no text, and you're supposed to, what does it mean? Does it mean that we need to help? But how do we help? And so I'll give a quote here on page 88. So Postman says, "Language makes sense only when it is presented as a sequence of propositions. Meaning is distorted when a word or sentence is, as we say, taken out of context. But a photograph does not require one. In fact, the point of photography is to isolate images from context so as to make them visible in a different way." On page 90, he discusses the flood of information, which is definitely a problem today. So much information, so much news, so many Facebook posts. Twitter messages. If you sit down and scroll through the internet, there is a lot of incoming information that you can be faced with. And he says, which I think is a little bit strange, he says that we really need to bring back the importance of the newspaper, which seems like such an old technology, but he says this, is that what the newspaper did, he calls it a public trust. He says that unlike more recent information media, the newspaper has a tradition as a public trust. It's given special protection by the Constitution, and then he goes on a bit more. But the point is that he later says is that the newspaper, in my words, the newspaper provides digested information, but the distinctions that Postman makes, he says that to bring back the distinctions between information, knowledge, and wisdom. We are getting a flood of information today, but very few people are doing the work it requires to digest that information into knowledge. And what Postman is suggesting is that newspapers provide knowledge, that you have someone who's hopefully a good reporter, hopefully unbiased, but that's pretty hard to find, I think. They look at the data, they check the police reports, or they check maybe they interview somebody, or they try to gather some information, and then they write a story based on the information they have. Now that's called knowledge. So we've digested that information, we've ignored precarious information, we have done some fact checking maybe, we have, right, etc., etc. We have edited, and we have provided the best we can given the available information, and thus we have provided knowledge, a newspaper article. That is hard to find on the internet. All you have on the internet is basically information. If you go to a good blog or a good podcast may have knowledge, but still, mostly it's information. Also, we have this category of wisdom. What is wisdom? Wisdom, Postman doesn't really discuss it here, but wisdom is supposed to be a lot of life experience and, of course, a lot of uses of knowledge to come up with wisdom that is expected to be time-tested principles that much knowledge has offered you based on what you know. That wisdom may be found in editorials, depending on who the writer is. Someone who comments on knowledge, right? So you have newspaper, you have the daily news presenting you information. You may have someone who goes through that information to give you a story on what's happening with something that might be knowledge. And then you might have an editorial which discusses what we ought to do. That could be wisdom. And so he says here on page 92 that the internet, for example, the internet, we do not usually address how we may distinguish the true from the false on the internet. By its nature, the internet can have no interest in such a distinction. It is not a truth medium. It is an information medium. But in theory, at least newspapers do have such an interest. So the newspapers, of course, have an interest in the reputation, and the reputation is supposed to be in giving unbiased and truthful accounts of what's going on. But the internet, there's very little of that going on because there's just so much information, and unless you go to a certain websites, you can find a lot of random stuff which you would have to yourself judge whether it's true or false. And Postman also says on this page, I am addressing a problem no culture has faced before, the problem of what to do with too much information. One answer, of course, is to make oneself inaccessible to it. So some people sign off. Some people delete their Facebook accounts. They don't listen to the radio or the news. They just wall themselves off from all the information. And Postman himself says he doesn't have email, which I think is pretty crazy. But, well, he he was an old, I think he was 72. I think, if I remember the Wikipedia page, he was 72 when he died, so I guess he died a bit young. But no email. Here's some criticisms now about television and the radio news. On page 94, he says, if I were asked to say what is the worst thing about television news or radio news, I would say that it is just this, that there is no reason offered for why the information is there. No background, no connectedness to anything else, no point of view, no sense of what the audience is supposed to do with the information. So again, this normative is coming back, right? Okay, now he discusses knowledge on the next page. So he says, I mean by wisdom the capacity to know what body of knowledge is relevant to the solution of significant problems. Knowledge, as I have said, is only organized information. It is self-contained, confined to a single system of information about the world. One can have a great deal of knowledge about the world, but entirely lack wisdom. That is frequently the case with scientists, politicians, entrepreneurs, academics, even theologians. And so now he says down at the bottom of the page, to begin to think about such questions, we would have to be referred to the body of knowledge we call religion, or the body of knowledge we call politics, or the body of knowledge we call sociology. So what he was discussing was cloning as an example. Knowledge cannot judge itself. Knowledge must be judged by other knowledge, and therein lies the essence of wisdom. He says wisdom does not imply having the right answers, it implies only asking the right questions. And now he gives an example of what he's talking about. So this is on page 97. So consider the US-Iraqi war. On television and radio, and in the press, generals, experts on weapon systems, and Pentagon officials dominated. So these are the people they had on TV and on the radio to talk about the US-Iraqi war. No artists were interviewed, no historians, no novelists, no theologians, no school teachers, no doctors. Is war the business only of military experts? Is what they have to say about war the only perspective citizens need to have? And so he says, what will the future look like? He envisions what he calls, but he doesn't think it will be exactly this, but he says he envisions, in addition to op-ed pages, that there will be wisdom pages. And these wisdom pages will be filled with relevant questions about the stories that have been covered. So these are essentially editorials. Questions directed to those who offer different bodies of knowledge from those which the stories themselves confront. And so he concludes a chapter which I think is a very good something to think about, something that we have to that we need to solve. He says the problem to be solved in the 21st century is not how to move information. So that's a means, that's a technology thing, right? Not the engineering of information. We solved that problem long ago. The problem is how to transform information into knowledge and how to transform knowledge into wisdom.